Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine. That's good.
Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for waking up early this morning to come talk about copyright issues. My name is Mike Smith, and I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and just recently joined the Technology Policy Institute as a senior adjunct fellow. I also co-direct a research center with my colleague Rahul Talang, where we look at how technology, from an economic perspective, how technology is changing the creative industries. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to talk about copyright protection, voluntary versus government arrangements. And again, this is copyright protection to me is an incredibly important issue that sits at the heart of two very important industries, the creative industry and the technology industry, and therefore sits at the heart of what the Technology Policy Institute is interested in. I wanted to frame this a little bit from the perspective of the economic literature. It seems to me like there are a couple of interesting questions you could ask about copyright protection and the impact of piracy. The first is, does piracy have any impact at all on media sales, right? You can come up with a variety of theories that say digital piracy is used for sampling and might cause people to become interested in the content, or digital piracy could increase the buzz for content and therefore might not have a harm, okay? Fortunately, we have about 10 years of economic literature that's looked at this question, and I think we're approaching a consensus in the literature that the vast majority of papers in the vast majority of settings find exactly what you'd expect to find, that being able to get content for free reduces legal sales. And in fact, Bob Hammond in a recent paper called this a well-established fact that piracy hurts sales, okay? The next question you might ask is, can we do anything about it? It's almost impossible to completely shut down piracy. As long as people have access to piracy, why would they ever go back to legal channels? And again, in the literature, we're starting to have some published findings on this question. So Rahul and I have a couple papers, one of which looked at what happened to music sales in France after the Hadopi law, the Hadopi graduated response law went into effect. And what we're finding is that music sales went up by about 20 to 25%. When people became aware of the illegality and the harm from piracy. In a more recent paper, we looked at the mega upload shutdown and found that the mega upload shutdown caused about a 7 to 9% increase in legal digital movie sales among the people who previously were using mega upload. Okay? So I think we're starting to get some results on the can. To me, the question, and the question I want to talk about today with the panelists is should. Can and should are different verbs. The fact that some piracy interventions can cause people to shift over to legal channels doesn't necessarily mean that we should use, and it doesn't necessarily tell us how should we intervene in these markets. Okay? So to look at that question, we have an all-star cast. To my immediate left, spatially, not politically, is Bob Brandeis. Bob is a professor of law and co-director of the Intellectual Property Program at George Washington University Law School. He's also co-author of a leading casebook on copyright law and articles on copyright, trademark, and constitutional law. Jill Lesser is the executive director of the Center for Copyright Innovation, a nonprofit established to implement the copyright alert system in the United States. Previously, she was Senior Vice President of Domestic Public Policy at America Online Time Warner. Chris Sprigman is a professor of law at New York University School of Law. He's also an author of a book, The Knockoff Economy, How Imitation Sparks Innovation. And he was a residential fellow at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Jeff Lowenstein is Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Congressman Adam Schiff. He advises the congressman on a variety of issues, including the two we'll be talking about today, intellectual property and technology policy. And he coordinates the congressman's work as co-chair of the Congressional International Creativity and Theft Prevention Caucus, which I believe is pronounced ICTIP. Exactly. Okay. And Shira Perlmutter is the Chief Policy Officer and Director of International Affairs at the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Before USPTO, she was Executive Vice President for Global Legal Policy at the International Federation of Phonographic Industries. So let me just kick this off. I'm hoping we can have a sort of a free-flowing discussion, but let me kick this off with a question for you, Bob. I sort of outlined the economic history on the question of piracy. Can you give us a little bit of background on the legal history of the issue of piracy, and maybe talk about some of the legal issues that come up in the context of copyright protection?
Sure. I mean, I guess I want to start by reframing your question, can we do something about piracy? How should we do something about piracy? And I want to reframe it as, in the modern era, the question is really, can we do something about radically decentralized piracy?
Great.
Okay? How should we approach radically decentralized piracy? Copyright law assumed, and was correct for most of its 300-year history, that piracy was in some sense centralized because it took large capital investments to print books and make movies and so on, press vinyl records and so on. But many of the businesses represented in this room and others in the technology industry have made it possible to decentralize that effort, and particularly with respect to movies and music, which is the focus of the copyright alert system. So I want to take you back, by way of a little history, back to October 12th, 1998. October 12th
Ancient history.
Happens to be my birthday. So but on October 12th, 1998 is important not because it's my birthday, because that's the date of the passage of the DMCA. Okay, and the DMCA took the view, well, it's true that lots of individuals are going to be uploading things to web hosts, and lots of links are going to be linking to individual stuff that was uploaded. So we got to deal with that with a notice and takedown system. The next spring, Napster arrives on the scene, and I know there was some talk yesterday about how the Telecom Act of 1996 didn't anticipate technological developments. Well, the DMCA certainly didn't anticipate the whole peer-to-peer phenomenon and Napster, and in particular, right, what the courts later ended up deciding was that although content owners could request the identity of folks behind IP addresses if they were web hosts or if they were information. They were providing links, if they were information location tools, that they could not, content owners could not request the identity of folks behind IP addresses if you were requesting it from ISPs who were just providing transmission services, right? And so that's what leads to the litigation of the RIAA from 2003 to 2008, because you need to go into court in order to get a subpoena to get the identity of the folks behind the IP addresses. That's what, of course, is still being continued today by Malibu Media and other pornographic video producers. But there's some real drawbacks to using the federal courts in that way. It's really expensive. And the only way you can recoup your costs is by forcing a lot of people into expensive settlements. And that has a lot of drawbacks, right? That's the public perception of many members of the public is that those settlements and judgments are disproportionate to the offense that has been committed. And it's not clear whether the model is viable, right? Even without that public reaction. So, so then up comes another model of, well, maybe we have resources within the control of certain people that we can use a contract-based system rather than relying on the courts and judicial process. And I have to say, the UDRP is in some ways a forerunner of the copyright alert system, because ICANN says, hey, guess what? We have the computers that control the domain name system, and so if we flip a switch, that's the end of your domain name connecting to your IP address. You no longer have control over it. And so we can now set up a much streamlined system to adjudicate claims by trademark holders in that case that the domain name violated trademark rights. So and then we get to the copyright alert system. So that's as much as I'm going to say in one go.
Okay. Well, Jill, I think that actually leads nicely into what you're doing at the Copyright Alert System and maybe some of the lessons and structures you guys have put into place.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here. It's interesting for me to come and talk about the Copyright Alert System sort of 5 years after the MOU was brought to life, and in part because even the understanding of the marketplace and the expectation of the folks at the table who dreamed up the Copyright Alert System and began talking about it really almost 7 years ago now, I think also could not anticipate where we were. So, I am almost talking a little bit about a system that is really the polar opposite of using the judicial system and the law to go after the problem of copyright infringement. And where we come from, and again, I'm talking about it from where I'm sitting right now. So what have I learned in the past 3 years in building the system consistent with the MOU? And that is that we're at an inflection point, which is the real goal here is to shift social norms and to shift behavior and to almost rejuvenate the notion of the value of copyright that existed in the world of books and vinyl records, to what some of us might think is ancient history, but in fact it really wasn't that long ago. So the Copyright Alert System, definitely emanates from the ability to notify users who are using peer-to-peer networks to share copyrighted material, to essentially give them a slap on the wrist, but more importantly, to pivot them and to teach them about all the various options that are out there, and to do so in a way that hopefully allows them to understand how the technology works, what the implications are of what they're doing, why they might want to secure their wireless, for example, what it means to have a peer-to-peer system that you don't think you're using anymore on your computer, but in fact is your share folder remains robust, and you're sort of engaging in copyright infringement willy-nilly without a true understanding. And so it's been a really interesting process, and one that, particularly for this crowd, one of the things that we can learn is the value of cooperation and the value of looking more holistically at the problem, of understanding that the growth of the internet, the growth of digital technologies, and ultimately the growth of really compelling content out there is in finding a solution to the problem of copyright infringement. And I have been surprised. When I was approached to take this job, I thought I am going to basically be, sitting in a room for 3 years herding cats. And in fact, that's not what has happened. It has been an incredibly cooperative, consensus-building group, so that when we sit down to say, what are the elements we need to put in place to have our 6-notice system, how should we build a fair appeal process? How do we protect consumer privacy? How do we ensure that the notices being generated by the content owners are done so with a robust, clear process that identifies only whole works and doesn't get us into a big sort of legal screaming match about the copyright alert, about the alerts that are being generated. All of those questions have been answered in a really consensual way, and the addition of our Consumer Advisory Board, which has brought brought consumer advocates to the table and really kept us honest. What about this? What about that? Have you thought about consumer reaction here or consumer privacy in this very small silo? And that entire process got us to a place where I think many of you know we released our first report of our first 10 months of operation in May. We were extremely pleased with what we found in that very small amount of time. We found, as we expected, having sent 1.3 million alerts, that the vast majority of those people were receiving alerts only at the education level, that those who received the final level alerts were a tiny percentage, that people did take advantage of our appeal process, which is what we wanted, but in very, very small numbers. And most of the people who appealed because, frankly, they were confused, and hopefully we were able to help them understand the system more and why, in fact, either they or more likely their teenagers in their basements were, in fact, engaging in peer-to-peer piracy. And the last thing I'll say in this opening is the other piece of what we've spent a lot of time thinking about, hearkening back to what I said in the beginning, is education and is the other side of this coin. So as we think about the next generation of moviegoers, music lovers, and frankly, musicians and creators, because our kids think so much more about, they are their own photographers, they're musicians, they're, how many videos of kids singing songs from Frozen or on YouTube? I mean, they are themselves.
That's another social welfare question, by the way.
Yeah, I only have boys, so we do not have Frozen in my house, thankfully. Lucky me. With all due respect to those who are making a ton of money off of Frozen. The goal of this system is not simply to end here, but to help in the shifting of the social norms back to what I would just say is the right balance, frankly.
Yeah. All right, so now it's my opportunity to stir the pot a little bit. Chris, it sounds like voluntary agreements are perfect at addressing some of the concerns that Bob brought up with the government role. Is that something you'd agree with?
Nothing made by human hands is perfect. You should know that. But I wanted to, before we get to that question, I do want to reframe this a little bit. So Michael, you asked two questions in the beginning. Does piracy affect sales? And can we do anything about it? And I think you left out the most important question that comes in the middle, which is, does piracy actually hurt creativity?
Great.
Right? So even if it affects sales, does that have any effect at all on creative output? Which, speaking to a room full of content producers for the most part, content distributors and some government people, I think this is a great audience to emphasize this point to. Copyright is not about you. It's about consumers and it's about artists, right? It's about the people who actually produce the content and about people who consume it. So what do we have? What evidence do we have on that question? Well, just think about the music industry. So music industry is kind of bottomed out, I think, at about a $7 billion RIAA member firm industry. Now, that's not the whole music industry, but of course, that's the recording companies. So that's about half of the revenues at their height, and adjusted for inflation, that's about a 62 or 63% drop. So that's really, really substantial. And I agree with Michael that the verdict is in. That has something to do with piracy. That is not unrelated to piracy. Now, there's a bunch of things going on, but piracy is a big chunk of that. It remains to be seen how big a chunk of that. Okay, so what's the effect been on the output of recorded music? Well, the evidence that we have suggests that there's more output than ever. And measured along a couple of different quality metrics, which are themselves subject to debate, but I think pretty good quality metrics. The quality is about as high as it was in the late 60s and certainly higher than it was in the 80s when I was a kid and copyright was in another perpetual crisis, but there was no Napster. Right? So it seems that, at least in the recorded music industry as a whole, the story from the perspective of consumers and producers, for that matter, is a pretty good one. Production keeps happening and people consume. And in fact, it's better than that. Because the same technologies, the same digital technologies that facilitate piracy also facilitate some very important things, like the creation and distribution of music, and the provision of information to consumers about what music they might like. So I'll just tell a story that I think illustrates this beautifully. When I was 15 or so, friends and I took a train into the city from Long Island, where I grew up, to see a band. And we couldn't actually see the band live because we couldn't get into the place. We weren't of drinking age. We stayed outside until they were done. And some bouncer told them that there were some kids out to see them, and they came out to see us. And the reason we wanted to see them was partially because we thought they were great, but partially we wanted to ask them what they were listening to. Right? We were that desperate for information about what was going on in London. Now, if you want to know what's going on in London today, you just go to Pitchfork and you can get all the information you want. I mean, not Pitchfork is just one of a million sites that you can go to and learn all about music. So consumers' demand is being satisfied better because of digital technologies. Producers are getting to an audience, building an audience, and building careers better because of digital technologies. Piracy is part of this, but it's not the story. It's just a small part of the story. And I think on the whole, if we care about the creative economy rather than the middlemen, now the middlemen are important, but they're not the story. If we care about the entire creative economy, I think the story's pretty good. I don't think we would be spending a whole lot of time in a rational world where we were looking at total welfare, worrying too much about piracy. Now, I think this is true in the movie industry as well. There's lots of capital flowing into the movie industry. There's lots of people driving around in Hollywood in extremely fancy cars. Piracy did not stop that. Piracy is a factor in the movie industry, but it is not fundamentally interfering with the way the movie industry does business. The movie industry continues to do business. The television industry. Why is there so much capital attracted to the television industry these days? It's pretty simple. Because the distribution of television is done through firms that have enormous market power. And so they have the power to rake out of consumers' wallets an awful lot of money because of a lack of effective competition. Cable companies, you know who you are. And what that means is that there's a huge pot of money that can be divided with programmers, and programmers, of course, are exercising every bit of leverage they have to get that money. That leverage includes providing quality programming. So in the context of audiovisual programming on TV, what matters more is market power. Copyright matters relatively little. It's not that it's irrelevant, and it's not that television piracy is irrelevant. It's relevant, but it does not really reduce the size of the trough at which all these companies are feeding, right? Much to the dismay, I would add, of consumers who are not terribly happy about the entire situation. So look, I mean, what do I think the background here is? I think the background here is that this problem has been blown up into something that it's not. So do I like piracy? Not particularly. Do I think it's a threat, a deep threat to our creative economy? Not in any area that I've seen, right? So I think, to some extent we're over-focusing on it. Now, the copyright alert system, which Jill talked about, I think is a really interesting effort because instead of attacking this with a sledgehammer, it attacks it very subtly. It attempts to change social norms through a combination of education and, frankly, the notion that you're being watched. Right now, what's interesting about the copyright alert system, and I think what I didn't fully appreciate when I first, came to grips with it, is how, in a sense, mild it is. So it applies only to public peer-to-peer, so public BitTorrent sites. It doesn't apply to private peer-to-peer trackers. It doesn't apply to cyberlockers. It doesn't apply to email. It doesn't involve deep packet inspection. It doesn't have some way of piercing VPNs or proxies. It's incredibly easy to evade, right? What does it do? It catches people who essentially are the most casual pirates, and it basically tells them that they're being watched, at least in the beginning, the mildest possible way. And I think to some degree, this might have, in the future, a disciplining effect on people's behavior. It might tell casual pirates that, look, I mean, everything you do on the internet is not anonymous, as if, we all should know that by now. Do I think that this is a solution to the piracy problem? No. But I think this is a way that I think, again, has some difficulties, and we can talk about that in the discussion if you want, but it is a way of reducing the size of it over time, possibly changing social norms over time that could be productive. Not perfect, but an admirable attempt.
Sounds good. Let me continue to stir the pot then. Jeff, do you agree with the characterization of piracy as not really a threat to the creative industries and generally a good thing for social welfare? And yes, I did recharacterize you, Chris.
Yes, you did.
I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole of whether, what the overall social welfare effect of piracy is. It's an interesting question. I guess from the perspective of sort of a policy-making perspective, and where my boss and the people I work with on the Hill come from, is that is it better to have a world with less piracy than we do now, and and is that achievable in ways that don't have ripple effects through other portions of the economy or other things that we would find undesirable? And I think the answer to that is yes. And so just to back up a little bit, and I'll give a little sort of quick background about some of the work we've been doing in Congress. My boss, Karshmam Schiff, is co-chair of the International Creativity and Theft Prevention Caucus. I still have to look at the name because we just changed it from the International Anti-Piracy Caucus. And it's about a 10-year-old group, about maybe 60 or 70 or so other members, but the Congressman Schiff and the other co-chairs, who are Congressman Goodlatte and Senators Hatch and Whitehouse, have sort of worked together on these issues for many years. And the biggest focus of the caucus has been sort of identifying where there are people or organizations or nations out there that might be susceptible to changing their behavior if somebody stands up and kind of calls them out on it. So a big portion of the caucus work has basically been using that bully pulpit to say, hey, to our trading partners, to over the years, to payment processors, to a whole host of other groups. These are, as sort of a good actors, we think there are steps that you can take to reduce the incidence of piracy and reduce the incidence that it has on the U.S. economy. Sort of the most recent thing the caucus has been most engaged in is on the ad-supported piracy. And I think everyone knows, if you go on a lot of the websites, whether they're cyber lockers or P2P sites or BitTorrent sites or a lot of others, you very frequently see ads appear on those websites, often from major recognizable brands. And so we think that's kind of interesting, because if you take the approach of, hey, there are actually people out there making not just sort of the social incidence of piracy, but there are people out there making a lot of money on piracy. And I think that's become increasingly clear. I think there's probably a lot more work to be done about sort of quantifying exactly how much. But there are people who are engaged in criminal operations, and they make a lot of money doing it. And ad-supported piracy is a big way that you can monetize a site that is getting all this traffic because they are providing free access, unlicensed access to movies, music, and so on. The approach we've taken is sort of trying to work across the industries. The online ad world is endlessly complicated, but we sort of have worked closely over the last couple of years with the IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the 4As, the advertising agencies, and the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers, just sort of say, we would like to come together, we would like you to come together and look at ways that we can less frequently see these sorts of ads on illegal websites. And I think we've started to see some progress over the last couple of years, and it's not an easy problem to deal with, but I think we've seen a lot of good engagement. And so the most recent sort of developments there have been back in April. We sort of the caucus again wrote to those three organizations I mentioned to ask, sort of where are we on sort of operationalizing the previous commitments that have been made and that were sort of put in the form of best practices and in the form of sort of adding some portions about copyright infringement to their quality assurance standards, and say, A, where are we on operationalizing that, because that's ultimately where the rubber meets the road, and two, where are we, and really I guess the other big question is like, where are we getting to a place where we can kind of measure the impact? And there's been a lot of good work that's still going on that, and I think there'll be more to talk about in the next few months. But they've been, I think, very seriously engaged in looking at what is increasingly a number of tools that are out there in the marketplace that allow an advertiser to say, hey, I don't want my ads to appear on certain types of websites, and now the technology is in place that that is actually an achievable goal. So I think that'll be a very positive development from the perspective of the caucus, and so I think from our perspective, that's just like sort of an example of we think that by engaging with people who are in the internet space who are interested in doing the right thing, who don't want to support piracy, and they can take relatively easy steps to do it, and so we're excited to see that going forward. And I guess I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to talk more about it later.
Good, thanks, Jeff. Sure, let me pose a similar question to you. Is there a role for government here, and what is the Patent and Trademark Office doing?
Well, a few thoughts. I mean, first of all, I did want to start out by saying I do believe piracy is a problem. As Mike said, there is really irrefutable evidence at this point that it has a substantial impact on sales. And I have to say that is a matter that is of great concern with respect to the U.S. economy in itself. So we do, certainly in the Department of Commerce and the administration, that is something that we worry about and we do think needs attention. I take Chris's point that ultimately, and at least one issue should be the effect of piracy on output and creativity, not just on sales and the economy. But I think the jury is still a bit out on that. There have been a number of studies done that have suggested there's a lot of continued output or greater output, but I think there's also questions about what type of output, what are the reasons and all the factors that go into it. So I don't feel ready yet to be able to express an opinion on the results. But I did want to say, one of the reasons I think for all the voluntary best practices is in part the costs and difficulties and problems with going to court, as Bob has mentioned, but part of it is also the difficulty of legislating in this space these days. I won't mention, of course, SOPA or the Protect IP Act, but we're all quite aware of how hard it is to do any legislation relating to enforcement on the internet. And so one question is, how can we move forward? And one possible solution is looking to voluntary best practices. Now, the copyright alert system is one very highly developed and so far seems to be quite successful example. But of course, there are some that deal with centralized as well as decentralized and peer-to-peer infringement. And so we have existing voluntary best practices in the area of online pharmacies, getting out of the copyright sphere, ad networks, payment processors as well. And we are currently in the Department of Commerce through the Internet Policy Task Force leading work of a multi-stakeholder forum looking at the operation of the DMCA notice and takedown system and hoping that we'll be able to come out with voluntary best practices that can help improve the operation of that existing system. So there's work being done. And I did want to mention that there's increasing interest in looking at voluntary best practices to deal with enforcement difficulties outside the United States as well. There have been recent movements in this direction in the UK. The European Commission has expressed interest in pursuing this kind of approach, so I think you'll start seeing this spread outside the United States. So I just would end by saying the Patent and Trademark Office is involved right now in trying to evaluate the impact of all of these different voluntary best practices. Obviously, CCI and others are doing their own work internally, and we'll also be looking at it as well. We were tasked by the IP Enforcement Coordinator's Office in 2013 in their joint strategic plan to look at the effectiveness of voluntary best practices. We issued a request for public comment toward the end of last year. We've been reviewing the comments, which are all posted on our website if you're interested, and we're now moving forward to start to gather some data that may help us do that evaluation. And I do think there's a role for government here. I think this is a very promising avenue for ongoing work. But government will be part of the mix, first of all, in terms of convening and facilitating discussions that can lead to voluntary best practices, as the IPEC did, and as Jeff is talking about the caucus doing. Encouraging and possibly putting pressure on, which might even be the pressure of ways to avoid legislation, if people can do it voluntarily. There's also a role in evaluating the impact, as we're trying to do, because we will always need to know whether these voluntary solutions are working sufficiently that there's no need for further steps by government, which could include legislation. And then finally, I do think there's an important role in making sure, as private interests negotiate these best practices, that we promote balance and ensure that there's appropriate protection for unrepresented interests, as in fact Jill has been trying to do with the CCI.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Jill, and sort of the lessons you guys have learned in the first year and some of the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of hearkening back to what Shira was saying about sort of the role of government regulation versus voluntary best practices. And, this sort of takes me back to my early days as an internet advocate and lobbyist for AOL, when there were, no fair information practices. There were no structures for privacy, for junk email, all the sorts of issues that have been dealt with to some degree by voluntary initiatives and to some degree by government edict. And I would say this, most importantly, is not so much the complexity of the political environment, but the complexity of the marketplace. And even looking at the MOU, which was signed in 2011, as we implemented the copyright alert system, we had to make many changes, either because things that were negotiated around a table by lawyers couldn't come to life in the way they were anticipated in the real world, or frankly because the market had changed so much and is changing constantly. And as much as our policymakers try to build into legislation and regulation flexibility or the opportunity to take a second look if the marketplace changes, I think we all know that for us sitting around our table, we've been able to make those changes on the fly. And even in the past year, go back into systems and make tweaks and edits to a variety of different aspects of our program that have just made it more nimble. And I think ultimately, therefore, more responsive. So one of the things I was talking about with a couple of folks before this is, as we think to year two, so in year one, in our first year report, we were really looking at what did we accomplish? But one of the things we were not able to look at is, what happened to the people who were touched? How did their behavior change? Where did we miss opportunities, perhaps, to change their behavior? And what does that ultimately mean for going forward? So some of the things we're looking at now, there is a difference among the different ISPs systems, how much of a drag on customer service resources it is. So why do some ISPs find more consumer questions? What is it about their interface? What is it about how they're instructing people to move forward that might make one system therefore more expensive and one ISP system less expensive? And those are things that we can, as we go forward, look at and change and advise. And so that makes the system really nimble. I think, the question about underrepresented constituencies, in the negotiation process, the ISPs and the content owners went out to several respected internet advocacy groups to talk about what they were about to do, and the notion of an advisory board actually came from that. And in fact, if you look at the MOU, the advisory board has a much more minimal role than in fact has in practice. I speak to our advisory board, one or another of our members practically every week. I pick up the phone and I say, gee, what do you think about this? And so it really is a collaborative dialogue. Whether there are more interests to bring to the table that we're missing, I think, again, we have the flexibility to be able to open up the room more broadly, and to, I want to hear, certainly as the executive director, a lot of different points of view. And if we can then bring people officially into the room, that's great.
Can I just say something? I just want to make sure everyone knows some of the details about what the alerts mean. So in the beginning, when you get an alert, it's basically just an advisory about copyright law and your responsibilities. And then later on, it can have some consequences. So some ISPs, for example, will take control of your browser and make you watch a copyright education video before you're allowed to browse again freely. Later on in the process, at least one ISP will throttle your internet speed, or perhaps eliminate access for a day. I mean, the consequences are limited, right? I just want to point out that in France, right, so we had this experiment in France with the Hadopi law, the three strikes law that probably most of you have heard of. So that was a law that resulted in, after 3 instances of infringement, the cutoff of internet access. So that law was repealed after pretty substantial public reaction. So France attempted something much more robust than the copyright alert system, and that collapsed. So I think what you get with the copyright alert system is you have something at the moment that's very modest. It has a relatively modest effect, and it's perhaps doing some work. Now, we don't know, how much work it's doing. So 1.3 million alerts in the first 10 months, less than 3% at the final mitigation stage, right? So less than 3% of the alerts reach that final mitigation stage. So there's 2 possibilities. One is that these alerts are very effective at getting people to change their behavior, which would be great. Another possibility is that they're not, right? What people are doing is they're switching, for example, to proxy servers or VPNs. So there's a little bit of evidence about that. It's not conclusive or even close. There was a large upsurge in internet searches for BitTorrent VPNs just after the copyright alert system was put into place. So there is probably some switching going on, switching of technologies meant to evade the system. How much, we don't know. So we need to know a lot more to have a fuller understanding of how much effect this is having on people's behavior. But again, it's a carefully constructed, Jill, system to try to shift norms, and that is a new approach, and one that I just find very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, maybe this is sort of a bad analogy, but to me, it's a little bit like, or I think about this a lot on the way to work, the speed cameras, they're everywhere now in Washington, D.C., and I am constantly getting tickets in the mail. And at what point am I going to slow down on that one road that I know I keep getting a speeding ticket? And, I think there is some analogy where it starts to become part of your daily understanding that you could, in fact, get an alert, that someone who got an alert. And what we find in our external research, so I do have some copies of the report for people who would like it, but I mean, what we found in our external research is that people really do would say that they, if they know about the program, if they know anyone who had gotten an alert, that they would actually change their behavior. Now, we don't have enough information to know that yet, and we certainly also found that we didn't have enough awareness. So we went out and asked people, did they know about the copyright alert system? And in fact, most people said no. So that's one of the ways in which to enhance the impact by having people know that the copyright alert system is out there. So I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Did you want to jump in on the parallels between Hadopi and France?
Yeah, so one clarification. Hadopi system is still in place. It hasn't been repealed. The change that was made was that they abandoned the most draconian outcome, which was getting your internet connection cut off, at least with that particular provider. And so now it's a system of criminal fines. And New Zealand also has a similar approach. And what we're seeing in other countries is that those that put the approaches in place that have started with the most strong consequences have cut back on the consequences. So also in New Zealand, where they started with termination of accounts, now they have a fine system as well. But those systems are still operating in both countries.
What's interesting to me is again, Chris, to your point, these are fairly mild measures, and yet we still might be seeing an effect. And I hear what you're saying about, it's hard to tell whether this is changed behavior in the direction of legal or changed behavior in the direction of illegal. But at least that some very mild interventions can have potentially effects on consumer behavior. And again, we saw that in Hadopi well before anybody got kicked off the internet, that sales went up.
Can I say that there's 2 things that come out of that? First is the remedy is something like the scale of the problem, that I think that we have a relatively small, discrete problem in terms of its effect on creativity from what I can see, and we have a relatively small, discrete remedy that may have the chance of doing some good. I think what's interesting about this, from the academic perspective, is it's an attempt to shift norms on a very large scale, right? And norm scholars are always very suspicious of that kind of thing. So they think that small, close-knit groups can be governed by norms, but large populations are hard to govern by norms. pushing in the other direction, if you think about it, most of us live our lives according to norms every day. So most of us, don't steal and we don't, break other laws, and not because we're afraid of the punishments so much, but because that's just not who we are, right? So norms do a lot of work for all of us in governing what we do. And I just think, this is an interesting experiment. Now, again, it's fragile because I think if you crank up, if the idea is we're going to get the camel's nose under the tent, we're going to establish a copyright alert system, and then we're going to crank up the penalties, we're going to cut off internet access, or we're going to do something like that, I think then people start thinking, well, wait a minute, is a bunch of ISPs colluding to do something pretty serious to me, which might include deep packet inspection if we want to expand this beyond just public BitTorrent, which is, of course, incredibly public, and everyone should know that. So again, I think that norm systems have to be modest, that they're modest essentially at their root.
Okay.
Chris used the C word.
We're not doing that. It's great theater, but we're not doing it.
Right.
But I mean, I guess I would say this, which is picking up on the norm piece. We looked at some research, some social science research in the course of actually bringing the system to life. And there was a Duke University professor who did some work around, ethical behavior and when people think they're behaving ethically. That we move through the world and we want to believe that we're ethical. So they did a couple of different experiments, one of which was, do people lie less frequently on their tax return if they have to sign it at the top? Right. And in fact, they found, yes, they do, because you sort of bring someone to the point of, we're looking for truth. They have a different reaction than if you're sort of, how much did I make? You sort of put the numbers in, you fudge it a little, and at the end, you've kind of forgotten what you've done, and you sign the document at the end. And there's lots of research that say that most of us move through the world wanting to believe we are ethical. So if somebody stops you on the street and says, hey, that is unethical, you just littered, or that, you have this sort of human reaction that is stop. Some of it may be based on consequences. I'm not, a social scientist, so I can't say, where the sweet spot is. But if we are going for not the people who are looking for VPNs when they know the copyright alert system is out there, but the vast majority of people who are doing this casually because you can walk into a room and say to your friends, hey, do you buy music or steal it? And that's perfectly okay. So how do we, number one, make it not okay? And most importantly, really, I think as the marketplace changes, allowing people to understand that there are so many choices and new choices every day at all sorts of different price points, including free, that are compelling and available. That's the way we shift the social norm.
And I think it's important to note that, it's all, no one piece of this puzzle is going to be the sole solution. So this is part of it. You can try to change norms and reach out to the individuals who are using some of these systems. You have to combine that with things like the follow the money approach that we're looking at with online advertisers and payment processors. So you build a system piece by piece where all the pieces of the puzzle together may make a real appreciable difference.
The part about offering stuff conveniently and at a fair price, the importance of that can't be overstated. And I think just, in terms of where we're going, that's pretty good news. So both in the music area with subscription services like Spotify or Pandora, and in the motion picture and audiovisual area with Netflix and Amazon and Google Play and all the other services that are popping up, Hulu, it's a very different world than it was when the piracy problem first kind of surged into public awareness. And I just think if you try to affect people's norms, right? If you do some of the things that Shira is talking about, which I think are relatively modest in scope and don't threaten to break the internet, and if you create a business environment where people basically think that the content that they really care about is available to them at a fair price, I don't think the piracy problem is going to go away. I just think the piracy problem is going to be reduced to a size over time where it's an annoyance. It's an annoyance like shoplifting is an annoyance, right? It's certainly something that we don't like, and we arrest people for doing it when we detect it, but we're not convulsed over it. And I think that's where we're headed, probably.
Bob, did you want to jump in?
Well, I wanted to, because part of the theme of this panel is comparing government intervention or legislation versus voluntary agreements. I did want to throw out a few concerns I have about voluntary agreements, or at least the particular voluntary agreement that we're focused on, the copyright alert system. And those two concerns can be summarized in two words: transparency and inclusiveness. So transparency, there have been 300 decisions, I think, or something more than 300 decisions on appeal by the arbitrator and we don't have those decisions. Now, I'm not saying that the arbitrator should produce full written opinions. That is going to destroy or seriously impact the cost effectiveness of the model. But presumably, the arbitrator is faced with these materials where there's a submission from the content owner that says, here's the name of the work and here's the IP address, and there's a submission from the person who's appealing saying, here's my grounds for defense. And it would be interesting to have some account of those to see how frequently are certain defenses being raised, do we have any concerns that the person who's doing those decision making are they following what the rules that courts would follow or not? We don't know the identity of, I think, the person who is making these decisions either. That would be different in a legislated system, or most legislated systems, right? I mean, we know the identity of most judges. When it comes to certain very narrow national security matters, we don't, but that's a narrow exception. And I would love to see, to the extent that the CCI produces information about the efficacy of the program. I'd love to see that be public as well. And then as far as inclusiveness is concerned, there's a guy by the name of Sean Flame who wrote an article suggesting there might be antitrust problems with the system. And he focused on the ISP subscribers, the residential subscribers, and maybe there's an organized boycott of those subscribers to the extent that they're committing copyright infringement. I'm not so concerned about that. I would be concerned about the effect on individual creators if the copyright alert system has a closed membership and essentially an MPAA member can say, or a RIA member can say, creator, recording artist, whatever, you should come to us because we have an agreement that does this kind of enforcement that your indie label or whatever doesn't have, and so we can provide you with certain advantages that you can't get right elsewhere. And that, I think, could raise an antitrust problem if you have a small number of very large companies saying, we're going to provide enforcement that these smaller companies can't, and then we're going to try to lock these smaller companies out. Now, I don't think it's anywhere near that yet, but I think a principle of more open membership, by contrast, if you go to the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition website, they run a program called Roadblock, which involves payment processing to websites. Right on the front page, you have join, here's how to become a member, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't see that level of openness and trying to pull in new members and so on with this system. So, and I think that's the thing that legislation would generally provide more transparency. Generally, legislation would be applicable to anyone, not just the members of the voluntary agreement. So.
Jill, do you want to jump in on that quickly? And then Tom, I'm going to look to you to whether we have time for a couple questions. Copy that.
Yeah, so I'll just comment very briefly on both of those things. The answer to both of them is yes. Yes, we not only believe there should be additional transparency, but are working on it, because I think another value to the system is for people to really understand it. There is a fair amount of precedent where for the American Arbitration Association that assigns the various arbitrators for these cases to actually legislatively be asked to run these small cases. So it can, it has been done in this way, but I think as it relates to transparency on efficacy, the way the program works, and frankly, there is some of the answers to your question are, in fact, at least for the first year, are in our report about, when the defenses were asserted and how many cases were successful, those kinds of things. They're already out there, and as we have more cases and the program doubles in size this year, we'll have more of that. And we too want to understand more about efficacy. And I think the value to understanding it is both the enhancement of the system as well as letting people know. I think on the openness question, I would think about where we are now as almost like a proof of concept. So, we've built something that isn't like join here and get our list of advertisers who are on our blacklist. We've got an operational program where lots of resources have been invested by these ISPs, where it is expensive for the content owners, including the independent, and we do include the independent labels on film and television and music, investing in generating those notices, and then we have to invest in getting experts to verify that the process to generate those notices is in fact fair and doesn't violate privacy. So the mechanics of getting to the next phase, now that we have this proof of concept, I think is what we're turning to next. But absolutely, we've had lots of requests from content owners in other industries and ISPs to join, and how we do that is, I think, going to be question for the year coming up.
So historically, my classes always run over, and today will be no different, but it looks like we have time for maybe one or two questions. And how about here and there? And there.
Okay, so yesterday we discussed Information Rules by Shapiro and Varian. And my bumper sticker for that book, for my takeaway from that book, is information wants to be free, but people need to get paid. And what I'm hearing from this panel is, let's go back, let's try to defend the legacy models of how people get paid as much as possible, and let's ignore the information wants to be free aspect.
Well, you're not hearing that from me.
Right, I'm not, right. I started to hear something different from you. And I just think that in the larger context of things, it's the business model. It's not the consumer behavior that's going to change. It's going to be the publisher behavior that's going to change. And the examples like Kindle Unlimited, right, and things like that. The old ways of bundling information with atoms are going to be replaced by new ways of bundling information with bits, and that's.
And can I just give an example that I think illustrates this very clearly? So we used to have a model in this country of newspapers. Newspapers made a lot of money from classified advertising, and this subsidized journalism. Craigslist came along. That model just imploded, right? Nobody buys a newspaper for the classifieds anymore. I mean, it's dead. Now, we looked at that and we thought, well, that's capitalism, right? A new business model comes along, an old business model gets blown up. Oh, well. Right? And now journalism, which is an incredibly important public facility, is kind of struggling to find a new way. And we're all watching it, but we're not at least, I think, considering kind of banning Craigslist and reinstituting the classified pages. It's in this area where technological change is much bigger than Craigslist, right? The entire birth of digital technologies and the move from an analog to a digital world have unsettled a whole bunch of business models. In this area, these legacy business models, which are largely inefficient ways to deal in the new technology, have a toehold, right? They can use the law to essentially try to cement themselves in place. Now, they can't only use the law, they can use the structure of kind of distribution, right? Legacy cable companies, et cetera. That's not a happy story for consumers. It's not a happy story for social welfare, right? We would have more economic growth if we just got on with the business of realigning the way that we provide content with the technological reality. And I think that's beginning to happen. It's just happened very slowly and painfully, and the law has been most of the reason why.
Isn't it more, I don't know, it just sounds like a very negative picture from my perspective of, even not even as in policy making terms, but as a consumer, it seems like it's gotten a lot easier to, watch and listen to what you want to watch and listen to.
Absolutely.
You can say it should be faster, it should be cheaper, it should be this or that. I mean, it's very hard to know what you're comparing to, because it just strikes to me as some hypothetical world in which, we can flick a switch and everything is different in exactly the way we want it to be. I think in the scheme of things are moving pretty quickly. I also think some of these, just from putting on my, work for an elected official hat, that some of the stuff is really hard to sell to people on the Hill. And maybe I have a slightly warped view because we represent a district in Los Angeles, and it's chock full of people who work in the movie industry and work in the entertainment industry, and they most certainly, and I'm not talking about the studio heads, I'm talking about the people who actually work in the industry. That wasn't a knock on any studio heads here. I'm sorry.
Can we turn off the camera?
And they see it very. I mean, it's very obvious to them, or it seems very obvious to them anyway, that this has an impact on them. And certainly that's the perspective that my boss brings to it, and I think the other members of the caucus, and I think still the vast majority of the Congress. I'm not saying there's nobody who doesn't see it differently, and there's certainly people who see. There's disagreements within all this stuff, of course, but that is the dominant view in Congress, and I don't think even there was SOPA, PIPA, and all that, and but it hasn't changed that much in my view.
Can I just say one thing, which is I really don't think any of these voluntary best practices are intended to be about preserving any particular business model. It's really meant to be to try to control piracy to the extent that lots of new business models can be developed and thrive.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of giving it to the person whose hand is raised the highest.
Both hands.
Both hands.
So, first, a couple things I'd like to say. Excellent panel. I've been very entertained.
You can even have a mic if you want.
Oh, hi. I've been very entertained. It's a really good panel, and also Twitter has been awesome in this discussion. So I wanted to say one thing about copyright not really having an effect on the market, because I believe that concurrent doesn't necessarily show causation.
Right.
So, I mean, why couldn't the plethora of new business models, which are out there that allow you to access content legally, I think that is more of an examination, or sorry, an example of how the market is changing on its own. And I think that that's something that can be found in a number of studies. And I also am losing my train of thought. And I think more and more artists are being compensated via copyright. More and more artists are being promoted and being able to have more people attend their shows and whatnot because of these different avenues of distribution. So I don't think, I haven't gotten from anyone that copyright should be thrown out the window. No. But I do think more respect for artists and them getting paid needs to come into this conversation. Consumers don't all deserve to have a car just because cars exist. Comments?
Can I take off my moderator hat and just say, I think Rahul and I are working, actually Rahul has a very nice paper suggesting that output has been hurt by piracy, right? That yes, technology. What's that?
In which industry?
Bollywood, and we're also looking at it in Hollywood.
Okay.
Yeah. So and again, we have a lot of economic theory that suggests increased incentives lead to increased output. So I don't think that's silly. Tom's standing up, so let me thank all the panelists for your time.